Hello and welcome to KIF. I'm here with my friend Alexandre. Hello, Alexandre.
Hello, Xavier Titelman.
Once again, this time we're going to talk about economics. In the previous videos, we analyzed a bit about the outlook on energy, etc. We were a bit alarmist. This year, it seems worse than last year, so we'll see how it holds up. This time we'll focus more on future economic prospects. It's often said Russia can't conquer or force Ukraine to surrender militarily. The war will likely end when one side's economy collapses. So let's do a quick assessment, mainly focusing on Ukraine, but also looking at where things stand right now.
From that perspective, some things are positive and others less so. On the positive side, the reserves of the central bank are at a historic high for Ukraine. So we have about 5 months of reserves, which is well above the 3 months that are generally considered acceptable. The currency is stable at about 50 hryvnias per euro. For several months now, inflation has been coming under control. This year it's estimated at 13%, and next year it's expected to be less than 10%. We're around 7-8%, so inflation is more or less under control. On the other hand, what's a little less positive is that growth is sluggish this year, expected at 2% and also expected at 2% next year. And obviously there are a lot of risks depending on how the war will unfold. And obviously the massive need of the Ukrainian state for international aid then.
But I don't know what share of the Ukrainian budget it is. It's a third half of its national budget that's provided by foreigners.
It's more than 50%.
More than 50% today?
The Ukrainian deficit is expected to be between 30 and 40 billion per year. Yes, which is about the equivalent of its donation budget. So
it's good and bad news. The Russians can't hit it, but that also means they depend on me.
That's why it's being discussed more in Europe, to seize Russian assets and find a legal way to transfer them to Ukraine in the form of a guaranteed loan or something else. Because obviously Europeans now understand that they'll probably have to keep helping Ukraine for several more years. That's going to cost, like I told you, between 30 and 40 billion dollars a year. And that's not even counting military spending. So if you multiply that by 2 or 3, it adds up to a very significant amount. Naturally, European politicians don't want their people to pay for it. That's why the discussions about seizing Russian assets have been getting more and more intense over the past few weeks.
To support the army and to support the economy in general. But when you talk about international financial support, it's gifts, it's loans, it's issuing debt.
No, it's not a gift at all. There is a part that is donations, but today that represents between 25 and 30% of the international aid given to Ukraine. The rest is loans. Okay, the rest is loans. For now, there hasn't been any bond issuance that is directly linked to aid for Ukraine. All right, but that could happen, especially if Russian assets are seized. There are many such ideas. For example, there will be a fund that will own these assets, that will manage these assets. They might issue tradable debt, but that's just an idea for now.
We're issuing debt to support Ukraine, expecting reimbursement from Russian assets later.
That's more or less it. I think that, first of all, we'll be reimbursed by Ukraine more than by the Russian assets. I believe Russian assets will be used to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. And the rebuilt Ukraine, with a much larger gross domestic product, will be able to repay the Europeans who helped during these crucial years.
Especially since, objectively, they are developing expertise in information technology, artificial intelligence, drones and weaponry. It's far better than what we do at home and much cheaper. We'll discuss it soon. You're talking about growth, but growth is weak. Seeing the power outages and trains only running to Kramatorsk, I struggle to get back from there. I could say that in the end, positive growth is actually not so bad. In reality,
yes, that's what I call developing growth. That is to say, today, obviously the war effort is driving most of the economic growth. That's to be expected. So obviously we're seeing public investment driving economic growth.
See Keynesian?
It's quite Keynesian. It's obviously quite Keynesian. After that, I agree with you. We've suffered Russian air attacks for months. The president said publicly that more than 50% of the gas storage and extraction capacities have been destroyed or severely damaged. The power grid has been damaged by around 20% in
previous destructions.
That's why for the past few weeks, you've seen it for yourself. There are still some pretty wild power outages, and it's something we have to live with. And we're in mid-November, and unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse until the end of winter.
As for the arms factories I've been able to visit, they have the capacity to produce electricity and heat energy independently from the grid. Normal industry likely does too, but without electricity and gas, it will stop.
Of course, it's suffering, but for the past 3 years, Ukrainians have been considering ways to reduce this problem. And for example, I don't know if you know this, but the Ukrainian grid is now connected to the European grid. So you can import electricity from Europe, and industrial companies have the option not to be cut off if they import electricity from Europe at a fixed price. It's quite expensive, but at least they won't be cut off. All right, so there are solutions that exist. There's international aid now, and we're working a lot on electricity storage solutions. All right, we're working a lot on independent generation turbines that will run on gas and will be connected to municipal grids.
Oh yes.
Very local, so we're working on a lot of solutions, but it's true that it hurts that a big country like Ukraine, which should be a net exporter of electricity, is forced to import electricity from Europe and to import gas from foreign countries.
Of course. So does that mean that in the end, as long as Ukraine has international economic support, it won't collapse? There is a resource that can endure, despite Russian offensives and potential destruction this year.
Economically, as long as the Europeans support Ukraine with around $30 to $40 billion per year to help its budget, plus they provide us with the necessary weapons. I don't see a collapse of the Ukrainian economy. That's something that isn't realistic. There are things that worry me, especially how many people have left the country. Yes, you have the figure of 6 million people who have left the country, and you have the recent figure, which is even more worrying. As you know, President Zelensky has given permission for 18 to 22-year-olds to leave the country.
Their studies, etc.
To pursue their studies. And the Germans reported a figure of 100,000 young Ukrainians who have left Ukraine since the end of August. This represents about 10% of the population in those Ukrainian age groups. So, in fact, we're starting to have the same problem as the Russians, in the sense that there's a shortage of labor, finding a salesperson today, finding a sales representative, even finding someone to install flooring in your home. It's becoming more and more, so we're really starting to have a labor shortage. And so the war for talent, we're starting to feel it. Even with European help, we're starting to run out of workers, quite simply.
Especially since people who settle abroad for 2, 3, 4 years, the more time passes, the less likely they are to want to come back once the war is over.
They have a stable job, they've enrolled their children in school. Every day that passes, the probability that they'll come back decreases, and that worries me.
There aren't 30 million inhabitants.
Listen, officially we're at 37 always, 36, 37 unofficially. We estimate, based on electricity use or active SIM cards, that we've fallen below 30 million.
Below 30 million.
We're likely around 29 to 29.5 today.
It's unfortunate, but we're only discussing the free zones. Those supported in the occupied zone aren't included. Let's briefly look at Russia with these numbers. I'm naturally optimistic and recently made a video about it. We're analyzing Russian revenues. The cash flow is getting less and less significant, especially from gas sales and so on, and from oil and energy. That's 40% less than before the war, but 600 million euros a day is still a lot. We can also see how fast their sovereign wealth fund is depleting. Apparently, it'll be empty in under a year. Can we say the Russians don't get financial support from China, or do they? They'll end the war because they can't afford to continue before Ukraine gives in.
So, economically, are they going to collapse? The answer is yes. The main question is when? Yes. Your scenario is a possible one, but unfortunately, it's not likely. That's what you're thinking. In an open economy where the people have a way to make their voices heard, I think that Russia can, for a certain time, finance its war through inflation. That is to say, impoverish the people who are not active. So retirees and civil servants. They probably have the means to keep the printing press running. There are also more violent means. For example, the expropriation of the oligarchs' assets, which represents several $100 million and then billions of dollars, obviously. And then, since Russians are finding it harder and harder to invest abroad, is there repatriation of Russian capital that was abroad back to Russia? And that obviously contributes to financing the war as well.
The end of the sovereign fund doesn't mean the state has no money, as a non-democracy could seize funds not rightfully theirs.
Inflation in Russia is very high abroad, around 10%, but could it rise to 17, 18%? Yes, the Russians will eventually face stagflation. Yes, but I think he is cautious, and unfortunately it is likely that during the next 2 years there won't be a collapse of the Russian economy. I wouldn't bet on it. It's possible, but unlikely.
All right, so no Russian collapse before 2 years, so that's why
We need to prepare
for a very long war,
which will last into 2026 and probably even longer.
the Flamingo will not speed up the end of Russia's ability to finance its war,
I hope so, yes.
but it's not some magic weapon as people claim.
Unfortunately, it's not a magic weapon, but it's a very, very beautiful weapon.
It's a good weapon, but the acceleration of the collapse of the Russian economy, electricity, because for the first time Ukrainians have the ability to make the Russians experience what they themselves are going through. Isn't there a point when the Russian mentality will say, well, actually this war, we're not making any military progress, we took Pokrovsk and 2 or 3 poor remote towns? Isn't there a moment when people will wake up? You're not a psychologist or sociologist.
Unfortunately, I think that Russians now, for a generation, have been under the influence, especially through the media, of Putin and the press organizations that work for him. I think propaganda hides the truth from many Russians. Unfortunately, I don't expect any awareness in the coming weeks or months.
It might happen, I hope so, but I won't focus on it. Unfortunately, friends, we must be ready for a war that could last 2 more years. Russia may surrender militarily before it gives up economically, which could take at least 2 years. Maybe Donald Trump, if he's watching us, had the right idea of achieving something concrete. Peace through strength. Donald, we promised you and still believe in it. Alex, thank you. Goodbye. We hope you enjoyed it and see you soon.